I'll be honest, I have fantasies about all of them. I'm tall, athletic, good-looking, a successful entrepreneur, and rich. I have an easy and relaxed approach to women, but I'm not really like that. I'm average height, average weight, never good at sports, and have always been a support for my outgoing friends. After the alpha males, I had nothing left. The term remnant more or less describes my first failed attempt to get over the fact that I had never been with a woman. I was at a sorority party when I saw this girl. She had brown hair and was standing at the other end of the room, looking just as uncomfortable as I was. Neither of us were in a relationship, so I walked up to her. She was of average height, with shoulder-length brown hair, brown eyes, and olive skin. There was nothing remarkable about her face or figure. She was simply brown. I said hello and leaned against the wall opposite her. She replied hello, and for some time we just stood there looking at the dancing people. My brain was screaming, "Say something, you idiot," but I couldn't think of anything to say. I was at a loss for what to say. Meanwhile, she looked scared. Inspiration struck, and I said, "My name is Peter, as in a saint, not a rabbit." It was a poor attempt at being witty. The fact that she didn't run away in terror showed how desperate she was. She looked at me and said, "Susie, she really did have." Her eyes were beautiful, dark brown. We stood there for a while, neither of us knowing what to say. Finally, I blurted out, "Do you want to dance? I'm clumsy on the dance floor, but I wouldn't have it any other way." She replied, "Sorry, but I don't dance." I was taken aback. What is she doing here? So we stood there for a bit longer. She said, "Would you like to go out and get some fresh air?" I could hear myself thinking, wow, this is a breakthrough. I said, "Of course, okay, that's awkward." So we walked out onto the porch. It was summer. It was a scorcher outside, but the party was even hotter, so the night air felt cool and refreshing. She was dressed in classic Bermuda shorts and a spaghetti-strap top that was popular among girls back in the day. I wore an old pair of cut-off jeans and a t-shirt that was a bit worn out. I was trying to think of something to say, so I asked her what she was studying. She didn't answer, so I asked her what she did for fun. She said, "I'm a city girl." I thought, oh, that's interesting. Then I asked her if she knew Wart. She said, "Wart? Who's that?" I said, "He was one of those guys who made us peasants miserable. Vert brought her. She must have some hidden talent." I blurted out, "Well, I would never leave you at a party. You're too beautiful." I didn't really mean it, but I started to like her. I had a puppy dog look in my eyes. She said, "Do you really mean it?" I lied, of course. I wouldn't leave a hot girl like you lying around. She said rather defensively, "How do you know I'm sexy? Were you talking to OK?" That was a bit unexpected. I hesitated and said nobody. "You're just beautiful, that's all." I started to sink with her. She must have felt the same way because she melted a little and said, "I work at the loft. You should come by sometime." I felt like I might be getting closer to my first real result. She wasn't a movie star, but she was also lacking in sophistication, which was my advantage. She also had a subtle hint of sexuality. It was a classic catch-22. I hadn't actually had adult sex yet, but I really wanted to try. I just needed to meet a girl who was experienced enough to know how to do it, but not so experienced that she wouldn't be interested in a 20-year-old. I'm not sure how old she was. The old guy who hadn't had sex before seemed to fit the bill. I was thinking about it when she started leaning towards me with her sleepy eyes and we kissed. We were silent for a second, just looking at each other. I was absolutely sure that I would score a goal. That's when Bill Worth reappeared. He said with contempt in his voice, "Susie, what are you doing here?" He pulled her towards him by the waist and didn't even notice how out of breath she was. That was probably fortunate for both of us, since he was the starting quarterback on the football team. He was huge, he added, looking at her angrily. "I was with my friends for a little while and you just left. If you want to be with me, you'd better watch your behavior." At that moment, I wished I could bring this guy down to my knees and make him apologize for being such an... Instead, I just stood there staring into space. I'm not aggressive and I don't have such instincts. It seemed to me that Susie was humiliated, but she immediately turned. He said, "What was I supposed to do when you left me standing?" I said, "I don't know. Wait for me while I do my thing?" He said, "I had things to do. I expect you to wait for me while I do them." I had a pretty good idea of what these things actually were because I saw him walk past me towards the parking lot with a very drunk Becky Allmendinger. Maybe I thought he was going to rush her to the hospital to check for alcohol poisoning. Maybe he spent an hour having sex with her in the back seat of someone's car. Anyway, Susie turned to Begans and said, "I was just talking to Peter while you were away. It wasn't that big of a deal." I was encouraged to discover that I was not that important. He looked at me and said, "Stay away from my girlfriend or I'll have a serious conversation with you." He was about half a head taller than me. So I didn't think this was world politics, so I just watched. She went without objection. My alter ego would have made this scoundrel beg for mercy at that moment, but I actually just stood there looking at him. I watched them go, and I couldn't help but think they were disapproving. I gave them the look of judgment, which seemed to fit the moment. As I stood there, I suddenly had an idea of what her hidden talent was. I was upstairs peeing when I saw her top on the floor in the hallway. Sounds were coming from the nearby bedroom. I gave her a well done and a pat on the back. I never saw Susie again. In the meantime, I finally got around to dealing with my little problem of sexual experience. It was almost the same situation I was at one of those street parties in the local park. This was an event that the Greeks sometimes held at the end of summer. I was as usual without a date. The party itself was held from the back of a truck. I was wandering around the park, drunk, because I was sick of watching the men and women of Phi Alpha and Lambda Tau get drunk. Total inebriation was such a weekly ritual among our student community that it made me wonder how the university managed to achieve its sterling academic reputation. I thought it would be interesting to see what it was like. I was in the forest, bored, lonely, and the foamy stuff they were dispensing from the back of a pickup truck fueled my curiosity. In any case, I was wandering aimlessly among the trees when I came across a female figure. She looked like one of the sorority girls. She'd climbed into the bushes to die. She was stretched out on her back on a soft bed of pine needles and leaves under one of the trees. The vision was strangely reminiscent of the scene of the dead soldier from the "I was reading the Red Badge of Courage" when I saw her. She was wearing a classic sundress, and when she fainted, she lifted the hem of her dress so high that it looked like she was wearing nothing but panties from the waist down. I walked over to make sure she wasn't dead. I was curious, not perverted. I'm a boy at the moment. Her body groaned heavily, so I sat down to check on her condition. I wasn't exactly Galahad, but I did show concern. She opened her eyes, looked at me vaguely, and mumbled, "Who are you?" I was about to answer when she said in a decisive voice, "Okay, you'll come." She grabbed me, and we had sex. I didn't know who she was, and to be honest, I was a little dazed from my first sexual experience, and of course, drunk. My noble alter ego would have stayed and called. I didn't call for help, though. She actually looked peaceful lying there, so instead I stood up and pulled her dress down. After all, I'm a gentleman. Then I wandered back to the party for more. I never saw her again. I don't even remember what she looked like. As far as I know, little Peterovsky is running around out there somewhere, but that first case of questionable sexual ethics, and I'm not sure who was to blame, opened the floodgates. I must have slept with a lot of unattractive girls on campus before I graduated. I wasn't interested in building up my social credit, I just wanted to repeat that experience. In fact, I've always believed that less popular girls exhibit much more inspired and noble behavior. You can really improve your technique with some practice. At least I had no complaints. I graduated from the Ross School of Business in Ann Arbor without any honors. He did his MBA and went to work at Ford. Then he spent 5 long years in the cubicles, which were pretty grim. It was like Marmont Town with about 500 people running around in their little 6x8 wheels. We were all packed into one huge room, but at least I got to the office, which was 8x1. It was a sign of favor and advancement in our anonymous universe. I also had a cobalt blue Mustang GT. That was one of the perks of working at Ford. This car made I felt a bit more exciting and like I had more value. So one Friday after work, I was hanging out with some of my colleagues on the open veranda at Andamos. I lived in a condo on Garrison Street, not far from Andamos, so it was an easy walk back to my place, which meant I could drink as much as I wanted on a Friday night without. I wasn't worried about the long drive home. There were some new faces in the group. This always happens because Ford is a big place and people come and go. As I sat down, I looked across the table at a girl I had never seen before. She had thick red hair and the milky white skin and perky nose of a typical Irish woman, with freckles. Her laughing emerald green cat eyes looked at me with humor and intelligence. She was around 5 feet 6 inches and looked distinctly Irish, but apart from those bright green eyes, there were no other special features. My friend Mary, who worked with me on our Tiger team, was captivated by those eyes. I was sitting next to her when she said, "Peter, meet Janet McCarthy. She works in client management, and we're working on a new interface together." Then Mary turned and continued her conversation with the guy who was sitting next to her. I didn't think it was a coincidence, so I said something like, "Good to meet you." She greeted him and went back to her usual reserved silence, simply looking at him for a few seconds. Finally, she said, in a sarcastic tone, "Do you like what you see?" He replied, "I'm sorry, you are so beautiful that I am speechless." "Yes," I replied, my voice firm and confident. "I'd love to." The room was filled with chatter, so I added, "I'd like to talk, but I can't hear you with all the noise. Have you eaten? I know a place that makes the best hamburgers in the world. If you want, I'll show you." This brought out another delightful smile. She really did have a wide, sensual mouth. She had a sensual mouth and said, "I'd love to go out to eat with you." I hate situations like this. I only came because Mary told me she has a hot guy she wants to introduce to me. Since I don't see him here, I think I'll leave with you. Wow. The ironic tilt of her lips told me she was joking. I hoped so. I took her to Miller's, a bar that was close to where I was and actually served the best burgers in the world. We talked for hours and drank several beers, to put it mildly. We were compatible, and then at that moment, in the depths of my soul, I knew that I was going to marry her. I have no idea why I was so sure, but I was sure of it. It was something about the way we connected. We were really connected, and it just felt right. Neither of us were in any condition to drive, so we left the Mustang in the Miller's parking lot and made our way to my place. I'd like to say we shared a night of passion, but we both more or less passed out. I woke up at dawn in a puddle of drool and found myself lying across the sofa. She somehow made it to I found her in the bedroom, lying face down on the bed, fully clothed. I covered her with a blanket while I examined her body. She was slim with delicate shoulders, a narrow waist, narrow hips, a beautiful ass, and long, absolutely gorgeous, slender, muscular legs. Her thick copper hair ended right between her shoulder blades. Even after a night, despite the harshness of it all, her hair was as beautiful as it had been when I first saw her. I think that such perfect hair is what God gave the Irish, in exchange for not being able to go out in the sun with their pale skin. I was frying bacon when she showed up. She was wearing one of my shirts and seemingly nothing else. One copper curl was thrown. She told me to make her a coffee, so I did, and she collapsed into the kitchen chair. She said, "You look as bad as I feel." I replied, "I think we got hit by a beer truck yesterday. Thankfully, it's Saturday. After all this drinking, it's good to get some nutrition. Fat in your stomach is good for you. You drink orange juice and eat this," and I put a plate of bacon and eggs in front of her. She went to town on the food, like a hungry grizzly bear. When she was done, she peeked suspiciously out from under her hair and said, "Did we have sex yesterday?" She seemed to feel a bit off, but I don't remember much after I told her I didn't think so. I was on the sofa and she was on the bed. I'm pretty sure I would remember our first time. She looked at me funny and said, "What makes you think this is our first time?" I said, "Because I'm going to remove this obstacle right now." We got busy. She finally opened one eye and said, "That's it?" It was the best sex I'd ever had. "When can we do it again?" I said, "Whenever you want, darling, because I'll never let you go." So it was. She moved in with me that same week, and we got married in a civil ceremony at the end of next month. We both didn't have much family or even friends, so it was just a quick legal exercise with we found witnesses nearby at the courthouse. We spent our honeymoon in Cabo for 2 weeks, and she tried to kill me throughout this idyllic period. When we returned, we didn't stop having sex. We simply began our new life together, as if we had been leading it for many months. 3 years later, we had both moved up the career ladder. I worked my way up the career ladder and became the chief architect of the enterprise. Janet headed up the customer service department of one of our products. Our combined income was enough to buy a very nice house in Dearborn. We lived the life of a typical high-income family without children. Then we had 2 children in a row, 1 and 2 years apart. First there was Sarah, then Dean. Janet took full maternity leave both times, and I tried to help as much as I could. Life is back to normal. Except for one big change: Janet has now given birth to our allotted number of children, 2.5 if you count me as at least half a child, and she said she didn't want any more children. We were still having sex a lot, so I suggested getting the procedure done. She'd made all the sacrifices before this, so I thought it was time to help her out. It's a simple operation, but it's still painful. I got through it, and the days turned into years. The kids grew up and became teenagers. 18 years have passed since the wedding. I was 42 years old. I was getting older, and I felt like I was no closer to the person I wanted to be. I looked the same as I did in college, only better dressed. I still couldn't do anything in sports, and my attempts to be the life of the party were funny even to me. Janet, on the other hand, has blossomed into a stunningly beautiful 41-year-old. Janet is now 41 and has grown into a beautiful woman with an attractive Irish face. Janet was a natural Celtic beauty. Her clear skin meant she could stay out of the sun, but it also meant she didn't have a single wrinkle. Her high cheekbones and perfect Irish features showed inner feminine beauty and confidence. When Janet walked into a room, every man looked at her and wanted her. Other than her striking appearance, though, we were very similar. She wasn't into sports and never went to the gym. Her slim figure had gained a few extra pounds since having kids, but they were in all the right places. Unlike any other woman I knew, she hated dancing and even socializing. Her whole life was built around me and our family. She was a great mom and an even better best friend. She was always Janet, and I were always ready for adventure, so we explored the world together. At first, we had kids with us everywhere. Then, when they grew up, we were accompanied by 2 proto-adults, and sex was like a refresher course. The connection this created was a special gift to our marriage. In public, we were 2 efficient professionals, raising a couple of wonderful children. But the sexual intimacy, that connection between us, gave us faith in our future together. We all know that deep down we are alone, but Janet and I drew comfort from our shared affection. It brought us closer together. We felt like we were moving through life as one. We were so aligned physically. I can understand why people have long-term marriages where one spouse dies and the other follows immediately. I know this sounds melodramatic, but I really couldn't imagine life without Janet. She was my necessary soulmate by the time we celebrated our 18th anniversary. I had finally secured the corner office by then. It wasn't as fun as it might seem, though. With real walls and a door came a ton of responsibility. Part of my responsibilities was to manage equipment and services for our unit. That's why I was sitting at my desk when my old enemy, William Wurr, walked in. I hadn't seen him since that night on the porch in Ann Arbor, but I recognized him immediately. He didn't know who I was, but even then, he never knew who I was. He'd put on about 10 lbs, and now it lay beneath the fat on his chins. He also had severe alopecia, which resulted in him shaving his head. All I could think about when he sat down across from me with all that pink skin sticking out over his tie was that he looked like a 290 lb penis. Of course, he hadn't lost his sense of self. He was more confident than ever, and now he owned a company, which made him even more arrogant than he had been in the old days. He was aggressive, had an aggressive ego and almost delusional self-image. I didn't react when he reached across the table to shake my hand. It'd been 20 years since we'd seen each other. Back then, I was just starting out, but now I was in charge. He knew it. His company provided services to Ford. The contract wasn't huge, but it was all he needed. He needed our business. We'd used Veris services for the past 20 years. His father made him president and CEO when he retired 3 years ago, and since the transition. We've been getting a lot of complaints about poor quality work. I met with W to look into this. He started with his usual, "How are you?" approach, which has always been his standard tactic. I knew he thought I was just a corporate nerd, but since the shoe was temporarily on the other foot, he was going to treat me like his best friend. We went back and forth over the list of issues until 5, just to give you a heads up, it's 30 pounds PM. He pretended to check his gold Rolex Yachtmaster watch and said, "Hey buddy, I'm hungry. How about we continue the conversation over dinner at the Henry?" I replied, "My wife is waiting for me at home. We always have dinner together." I could see that he thought I was under my wife's thumb, but he carried on with his happy act, saying, "Let's just take the baby with us, call her out. I'll treat you." I didn't want Janet to be influenced by this guy. She hated bragging, and W was one of the worst, but I was stuck between a rock and a hard place. I had the upper hand in our negotiations. And I didn't want to lose it, but I also didn't want to leave Janet sitting at home alone, so I called her and asked if she'd like to meet us at the restaurant. She said, "Wow, who do I owe this honor to? I've never been taken to such an expensive place." I replied, "The supplier pays and we will. We can discuss matters, but I didn't want to leave you at home. If you want to go," she said, "I'd love to go, especially if we don't pay. I'm guessing you want me to dress up." I replied, "He's just a supplier, but let's see if you can hit him." I was going to give the guy some change for the incident on the she said she'd be on full alert. "I love you," she said and hung up. She showed up an hour later, looking great. We sat at a table on the other side of the room, which was as far from the entrance as possible. That meant she had to walk through the entire restaurant in her 10-centimeter stilettos. She had a gorgeous ass that wriggled enticingly as she walked towards us. She was a beautiful, confident woman in a tight little black dress that perfectly highlighted her best feature. The thick mane of copper hair and the cut-out front showed off her large, round breasts. She was also wearing a small gold chain with one perfect diamond bobbing in the gorge between these two impressive hills. Diamond bobbing in the gorge between these two impressive hills was the finishing touch. Her huge emerald cat eyes were hypnotic, and her wide, sensual mouth was impeccably painted to highlight her knowing smile. Her freckles and perky nose made her look like the hottest and most sophisticated. She was the girl next door, approaching us with her eyes fixed on me. I found myself unable to look away, drawn into two deep, loving eyes. I thought to myself, how lucky am I? I looked at W to gauge his reaction, but it seemed like he'd swallowed his tongue, his jaw almost touching the table. Janet and I stood up as she approached the table. She extended her hand to me and said, "I'm Janet, Peter's wife." Wart looked at her with pure delight. He then put his mask back on and turned into good old Bill. He laughed loudly and said, "Well, he certainly knows how to choose." Janet blushed and replied, "No, I'm the director of customer relations for dealers in this region. I've been working in customer relationship management since before I met Peter." He laughed again and said, "Well, I'd like to be your client." It might sound like a harmless flirtation, but there was another subtext to it. We both decided to ignore him and sat down at the table for dinner. W dominated the conversation. He was paying, so I just let him talk. He was clearly courting Janet, and I didn't blame him. She looked especially attractive that evening. His way of impressing a woman was to talk about his possessions. According to him, his house, which was on a lake in Oakland County, was the largest in the development. His boat was the fastest on the lake. His many cars were he had expensive classics, and he rubbed shoulders with every celebrity and influencer in the Detroit area. Oh, and as an afterthought, he mentioned that his wife and kids are really cute too. After the second bottle of wine, he stopped talking to me. In fact, he turned his back to me in his seat so that he put himself between Janet and me. Most people trying to seduce someone would be a little more subtle about it, but this guy has always been extremely arrogant. He was used to getting any woman he wanted, so he was very direct and persistent with Janet. He continued to drop suggestive hints. He dropped hints about his sexual abilities. In fact, he became so aggressive that Janet didn't overdo it on her part. She is into customer service and knows how to treat people, especially with men like him. By the time we finished dinner, she had convinced him that he was indeed a very interesting person to her. As soon as we got back into the car, she angrily said, "This man is absolutely disgusting. He didn't give me space the whole time. How do you even contact him?" I replied, "He owns a company that is completely dependent on our business. When we first started working with them, they were he's a notch supplier, but things have gone downhill since he took control. We're trying to decide whether to look for someone else, but I thought I'd give him a chance to convince me otherwise. I need to do a little more checking, but I think we will not continue cooperation. From what I saw tonight, I can see why his company is struggling. He's bossy, long-winded, and rude. I noticed that Janet was particularly eager in bed that night. Despite her reservations, I think his attention definitely turned her on. I have to admit I was a bit jealous the next day. On the next day, I carried on negotiating with Worth. It was obvious that he thought he'd convinced me after dinner. He was also clearly too interested in my wife. He asked me lots of questions about her, how we met, and what the current state of our marriage was. At one point he even said, "I bet she's a bomb in." In bed I told him that I didn't appreciate these types of comments, and that if he wanted to continue doing business with us, he should keep it professional. He responded with his usual smug attitude, saying it was just a compliment, and that there was no need to make a fuss. He also said that I was a magnet for women, and that his wife was very attractive. I appreciated what I suggested, but the person I would like to be could have handled it better. He humiliated both me and my wife, but instead I gave him a look that said he was on very thin ice. I hated being such a weakling, but what options did I have? If I'd stuck to my guns, he'd have got all puffed up like a grouse in mating season. He knew it'd be pretty awkward discussing my wife's bedroom skills right there in the office with all my colleagues. I still needed to work there, so we haggled for the rest of the morning. We agreed on the last sentence and shook hands, not very friendly, I might add. He then set out to make other people's lives miserable. This was on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. The respective managers and I spent the entire day in meetings deciding what to do. My people kept digging, and the general consensus was that we could get a better quality product at a lower price if we switched to a competitor. But I had to tell him the news in person. That's how I've always done business, and I wanted to maintain civility, so I called him on Friday morning and told him I would meet him at the Dearborn Inn at 5 p.m. Morning. We've got a permanent presence there, since Henry Ford built it. So the lobby of this famous old hotel seemed the perfect place to wrap up our business. His tone of voice let me know that he thought I was going to seal the deal when he walked in. I was standing there with Tom Ali, who was our vice president of corporate purchasing, and Vic Ravi, who was our guru. Word approached us as if he was about to cash in a winning lottery ticket. He no longer maintained the good old Bill facade, instead he exuded his perceived superiority. I looked at Tom Ali, and he looked a little worried. I thought, let's get this sorted out as soon as possible, I said, trying to sound as sympathetic as I could. Bill, we need to talk about our contract. He smiled in what could only be described as a smirk and sat down in the fourth chair. He leaned forward and said to the three of us, "I knew you couldn't find anyone better." There was a brief pause. I looked at Tom and Vic and said, "That's the point. We've already found someone else, so we're canceling your contract at the end of the day. If you have any questions, ask them now." I could see Don's reaction in an instant. He went from looking confident to looking angry. He went from confident to angry in the space of a few seconds. I could see why he was so upset. Our business was his company's main source of income. If we refused, he'd have no choice but to let us go. He said, "You can't do this." I replied, "We can and we do. We just don't think you're right for us. It's a matter of trust in your services." Ali spoke up then. "Our lawyers have looked at this from every angle, and legally this is an impeccable situation. We have already sent a written notice to your company by courier. We're sorry, but we can't afford any more disruptions." Ravi added, "We've had 2 more glitches this week, and it's costing us a lot of money." W stood up from his chair. He was much larger than any of us, and he was furious. We all stood up with him. I tried to calm him down by saying we wanted to give you a chance, but it didn't work. "I'm sorry," and I extended my hand, for the last handshake was followed by a torrent of abuse. Saliva sprayed from his mouth as he screamed, "You're sorry? You have no idea how much you'll regret this. You old coward. I will sleep with your wife. She'll love it, and there's nothing you can do about it. In fact, I think I'll keep her for a while as my personal prostitute." I heard the words, but could not comprehend them. I just stood there, not saying anything, with my hand hanging limply in the air, and my mouth wide open. Then, without saying a word, W turned and walked out. I remembered an incident 20 years ago, and it made me feel inferior again, like I did before I met Janet. My colleagues seemed amazed and sympathetic. I must have looked pretty upset. I wish I could brush it off with a joke, but I know the story will be all over the office by the end of the day. What's worse, I think Wart will do what he said he would, and that's made me feel really jealous. I know I tend to doubt myself, but I guess it's a result of always being picked last at baseball games and spending all social events on the sidelines with other wallflowers. Janet changed all that. I felt like a special person because she was so special. However, I was also alarmingly aware that Janet was now out of my league when we first met. For many years after that, our social status was roughly equal. But at 41, Janet has blossomed into the ultimate trophy woman, while I have moved into a well-middle age perhaps. The difference between our social status and how we acted on it. His shaved head made him look dangerous and exciting, and he seemed confident that every woman he met was eager to try him. Unfortunately, my insecurities told me that I wouldn't be able to keep Janet if W really started hitting on her. When it came to seduction, he was an apex predator, and I could tell that W really wanted my wife. Janet never expressed dissatisfaction with me or our life together. In fact, it was the other way around. We spent every moment of our lives together except when we were at work. She was always in a hurry to come home to me, just as I was in a hurry to go home to her. Wart was big and extremely confident. He slept with everyone. There was something about his assumption that every woman wanted to submit to him. Perhaps it was pheromones, or an alpha male attitude. Whatever it was, I had evidence that it was effective. Now he's targeting my wife. My stomach was churning as I drove home. I just knew I was going to lose her. The thought of it was killing me. However, I solved problems as they came. Janet and I always discussed important things honestly and openly, so tonight we had to have one of those conversations. Even if it would make me look paranoid and a coward, I arrived home first. She arrived a couple of minutes after me. She looked tired, but she works a lot more than me. All this interaction with unhappy customers is draining her. I prepared the sushi from Crave on the way home and laid it out on a platter with a couple of cold Asahi bottles. When she saw what was waiting for her, her eyes lit up. She loves sushi. She said, "Let me get out of these things and I'll see you on the patio." It was a warm October day, and it would have been a shame to waste the sunshine. We probably won't see him again for 5 months in Michigan, so I moved our feast to the street table. She came out looking fresh and cheerful, wearing a patchwork blouse and yoga pants that showed off her hips and ass. She could be the mother of a 15-year-old. She was old but still had the sexiest body in the Midwest. I got straight to the point. I said there was a serious matter I needed to talk about. Janet is an intelligent and sensitive woman. She could tell something was bothering me, so she instantly switched to full concentration mode. It was a bit embarrassing how quickly she could concentrate. I continued trying to sound I just had a meeting with Bill to discuss the termination of his contract. As you might imagine, the meeting itself was pretty intense. But what I really want to talk about is what happened when he left. It was pretty disturbing, and we really need to resolve it. I could see that something had just flashed across her face. I thought, oh my God, he was already there. So I tried to keep my voice calm and said, I don't know if there's a better way to say this, so we've always been honest with each other, and that's why I believe in you and in our marriages. She gave me a loving smile and took my hand, like women do to show connection. I tried to convey seriousness in my tone, but he was already angry when he left. In fact, he was so angry that he told me he planned to sleep with you and make you his. He said that since we ended things with him, there was nothing I could do. He's always defined himself through his sexual conquests, so I think he'll try to add you to his list. Janet screamed instead of turning pale with guilt. She just got redder and redder. I saw that she'd lit the fuse of her Irish temper and she was about to explode. She's passionate at heart, and sometimes her control slips. It was one of those moments she was mad with rage. She stuttered for a couple of seconds and then said, I'll kill him. I thought to myself, that sounds like a confession. I was stunned by her sudden change of mood. It even surprised me. The cheerful and loving wife I knew a few seconds ago was replaced by a crazy one. She said that idiot has been calling me every day since Monday asking to meet. I told him in no uncertain terms that I was not interested, but he has no shame and is absolutely furious. He just doesn't seem to hear me when I say I'm not interested. I should have told you, but so far it's not a big deal, but I thought it would eventually stop. I was wrong. This is more than just some guy acting like a child. It's humiliating for both of us. It makes you look weak, and it makes me look like a woman of easy virtue. So, what are we going to do about it? I felt a sense of relief wash over me. Over me, that could have made the Fukushima tsunami seem like a minor disturbance in the bathroom. All I could think about was how much I loved my determined and strong wife. Janet began to calm down, but she was still pacing the patio as if she was looking for something or someone to hit. I've never seen her so angry. The guy was just being so impudent and unapologetic. I've never seen her so angry. It was obvious that her mind was working on a problem. Then suddenly she put down her beer, leaned forward, grabbed my hand and said, "I have an idea." "How much do you trust me?" I answered with my life. My voice suddenly wavered. She was excited by the evidence of fidelity she'd just provided, and it seemed to put a lot of ghosts to rest. She said that maybe Bill Wurr and I should go on a date. I wasn't offended by this. It did make my heart skip a few beats, though. She smiled at me with a mischievous smile. I could see that she had a lot of naughtiness in her Irish soul, and I could see that she had a plan for Mr. Verta smiled and said, "How about I dress up and spend the evening making him think he's going to get what he wants? When he makes his move, I'll tell him all the ways he can never measure up to you as a man." I loved it. It was probably the dumbest plan I've ever heard, but this was pure Janet. Janet is very proud and brave. She couldn't just She had to get some form of direct payback, and as far as she was concerned, the more spectacular and active the payback, the better. This shocked me. There were serious problems, and I outlined each of them. First, she'd be alone with a jerk, and she had no defense against the type of physical attack he was capable of. Secondly, I had no idea how sneaky and underhand this guy could be, especially when it came to achieving his goals. The worst thing was Murphy's Law, that thing that says something unexpected will turn an attempt at personal retribution into a disaster. She smiled at me indulgently and said, "You know that I already had sexual experience when we met. I have years of. She's dealt with scum like Vert before, and she's not going to let him anywhere near her while she's got this." She stood up, went into the house, and came back with her asp. She put it on the table with a smug grin on her face. She's not one of those women who likes being protected by a man. Not that I'm any good at it, so she spent time training with a personal trainer to learn how. She said, "I'll have this baby in my purse, and I just hope he tries to do something." She was right. Janet is not what you'd call timid. In fact, she's furious. Her training with a stick during class was intimidating. However, I believe in karma, and I have a bad feeling about deliberately teasing this narcissistic bastard. Janet has always been the braver of us. She's a woman, and has never experienced the type of physical bullying that the average guy faces growing up. When it came to confronting bad people, she never learned the lesson that caution versus courage is important. I actually argued with her for quite a long time, but her stubborn little mind was determined to humiliate me and her, and she wanted to take revenge. So on Monday, she came back from work looking like the proverbial cat that ate the canary. I asked if he'd called. She said he had, and that next Friday they were going to have a big dinner and a lot of humiliation. He wanted to do it tonight, but I told him I couldn't leave her until Friday. This would give us time to work out the details. I said I was only going along with this because you can't stop thinking about it, but I have to say that I don't like it. She laughed and said, "I know you're kind and gentle. I hope I didn't come across as a coward, but I just can't let it go." When he questioned my loyalty and called me names, I knew I had to call him out. Maybe it's a cultural thing. My wife is Irish and has a short fuse. She'll confront anyone about anything. I'm Polish, and with the Germans on one side and the Russians on the other, my people learned long ago not to wake up sleeping dogs. Besides, I was already enjoying the moment of revenge, but I did it my way. I lost our business, but I got back at him. I made a few phone calls on Monday and he went bankrupt. He just didn't know about it yet. The plan was simple. She would meet him for dinner. At Andos, she'd be dressed to drive him crazy. She'd then flirt with him to keep him interested. When he finally arrived, there was no doubt he'd be ready to prep. She planned to tell him what she really thought of him and throw a drink in his face. I was actually hoping it would be hot coffee. She'd then make a spectacle of it by joining me as I arrived from the parking lot for a hug and kiss before we left stage left. It would be a fitting ending, like a Shakespearean play. The plan seemed impenetrable. It was in public, and Worth wouldn't do anything in front of witnesses. Once Janet challenged him, she would be safe before he could respond. Best of all, it would put a wonderful end to my relationship with this idiot. But I still had conditions. I obviously couldn't be seen until the grand finale, but I wanted to keep my eyes on the target the whole time. So it had to happen I was walking around the venue because the bartender there was a good friend of mine. I saw him a lot and tipped him well, so I needed to be nearby. I couldn't sit in the parking lot, but I could sit in the museum parking lot around the corner. I was counting on a call from my bartender friend Mario when it was time for me to go on stage. I was sitting with Dean, helping him with his school project, when she came down the stairs dressed for a date. I actually laughed out loud. I was surprised to see that she had copper hair, porcelain skin, emerald eyes, and bright red, sensual lips. She had gone all out with her makeup and hair. Her high cheekbones, sprinkled with freckles, and huge green eyes were captivating. She always had magnificent legs, slender and muscular, and she showed them off in a dress that ended a few inches above the knee. Walking in foreign heels only accentuated that gorgeous bubble butt. But the newest addition to her arsenal of tools was Janet had a pair of much larger teacup bras kindly provided by the children when we met. She had dainty little B-cups, but as soon as Sarah arrived, Janet transformed into a full, round C-cup bra that was so high on her chest and fitted tightly to her that it didn't matter whether she was wearing a bra or not. She had natural cleavage. They almost didn't seem real, but I can attest that every inch and pound of it is genuine after extensive tactile testing. She posed at the bottom of the stairs, and she said, "Do you like it?" That was our catchphrase. She used it to remind me who exactly this exquisite body belonged to. I was amazed by her beauty, but at the same time, I felt a sense of overwhelming uncertainty. I knew all about motivation and planning, but I still felt a pang of pure jealousy when I saw her dressed for another man. She was so tenderly feminine that I couldn't imagine how she could even accomplish what she planned. But underneath all that, she's got pure sex appeal. My wife is a warrior. I went over to hug her. I knew better than to kiss her and ruin her intricate makeup. Her perfume amazed me. She gave me a bright smile. I saw that she was enjoying it. This reminded me that Native Americans would hand over their captives to women. That is, if they wanted to be properly tortured. Women are ruthless when you ruin their families. She said, "See you in a couple of hours. Sweetie, please don't be late." She then gave me a mischievous look. I gave her a cheeky grin and closed the door. I heard her car start and drive away. I grabbed my coat and Kindle, told Dean to behave while I was gone, and walked out into the beautiful autumn evening. The taillights of her rental car had already disappeared from our street when I got into mine, an F-150 King Ranch. The Mustang I had when I was single is long gone, but this truck looked like a luxury car with sporty handling. I knew it would take Janet 2 or 3 hours to bring the hammer. I followed Mr. Beaumore's advice, so I drove the 150 into the deserted car park behind the Dearborn Historical Museum. I tuned the excellent audio system to the local classical music station and opened my recently acquired copy of the latest Jack Reacher novel, In My Dreams. I'm 6 feet 1 inch tall and have 250 lb of hard muscle, so I have a lot in common with Major Reacher. I imagined what was happening in the restaurant. I was sure that Janet's stunning looks would make W look. I was as eager as Billy the Goat and sure that Janet would give him her full attention either way. She's a bit of a tease. Flirting is as natural to a beautiful woman as preening is to a peacock. A woman like Janet has been fooling guys since she was a teenager. Therefore, manipulating men is as natural for her as throwing stones for little boys. Just as I was getting to the good part, my phone vibrated. It had only been an hour and a half since Janet had left, so I said hello, and Mario replied, sounding concerned. "Pete, you asked me to look after your wife, and I have some bad news. She was having dinner with a guy, and I think he put something in her drink. He got her out of here about 15 minutes ago, and she didn't look too good at first. I thought he was just helping her to the bathroom, but I think they went out the back door. I don't see any of them here right now, and I've already checked. I could feel the fear in the air." I asked Mario if he had any idea where they were going. He said he didn't, but that he would try to find out what car they were in. After a couple of tense minutes he came back and said, "Danny, the valet says it was a gold Escalade." Mario added, "Good luck, mate. I never thought that bastard would do something like that. I knew it. If mere mortals defy the gods, they will face a cruel lesson." I tossed the Kindle into the passenger seat and revved the engine. The 15O's got a powerful engine and shot out of the car park. All I could think was that karma is a heartless, and Mr. Dares Murphy is never wrong. I shouldn't have let Janet go on such a crazy adventure. I was trying to think of where he could take her. I knew I was doomed if he'd made a motel reservation. There are too many of them in this area. Worth didn't seem like a man who planned ahead. He was clever, but not strategic, so I tried to think of a secluded I needed to find a place that would attract him. He probably didn't want to go too far. There were many trees around Henry Ford's homestead to the north, and it was the most secluded place for miles, so it seemed like an obvious choice. If I'm wrong, Janet will pay the price, but I needed to do something. I said a prayer and stepped on the gas. Luckily, it was after 9 p.m., and the roads that would have been crowded during the day were almost empty. I headed north and made one of those pointless Michigan U-turns. I turned and headed back down Evergreen. The University of Michigan Dearborn campus was on the right. It looked deserted on a Friday evening. I turned off Evergreen onto Fair Lane Drive. This road led to Henry Ford's estate. It was completely dark. Even though it was right in the heart of a large metropolitan area, there was some residual light from the moonlight. There were no streetlights. I slowed down to 25 miles per hour, looking for any sign of an Escalade. I thought I saw a shape as I drove past the driveway leading to a deserted place between Fair Lane and Evergreen Estate. I turned down this little path, and there he was, parked in the circular courtyard that must have once led to the building. It was probably a former outbuilding on the estate, but now it was just a large... I spotted a clearing in the forest with one car parked at the top of the circle. If his Escalade's windows weren't so foggy, I might have seen my headlights. I grabbed my phone and called. I told them what was happening and where to send the police. Then I got out of the car to save my wife. I could see the Escalade shaking and heard the telltale sounds of sex coming from the back of the car. I grabbed the door and opened it. It was a terrible sight. W had gathered his thoughts and rushed at me. I knew I needed to stall until the police arrived. "You're in a bad situation, kid," I said, trying to catch my breath. "You better start thinking about a good lawyer." As the police cars drew closer, he seemed to realize what was going on. He turned and tried to run away, but 2 police officers had already got out of their cars and were heading towards him. One of the officers shouted, "Stop, police!" while the officers were handcuffing him. Another officer came over to me and asked, "Are you okay? Do you need medical attention?" He was examining me for injuries, so I told him I was fine and tried to calm my breathing. I pointed at the Escalade while one officer attended to Worth, and another approached the vehicle to check on Janet. I followed him, my heart pounding with fear for her. The officer carefully opened the door, and Janet was lying in the back. Janet was out like a light, but breathing. Her face was pale and foam was visible on her lips. The officer called for an ambulance, and we waited a few minutes until it arrived. The paramedics assessed Janet's condition, placed her on a stretcher, and loaded her into the car. I followed. The ambulance was in the car, and I was filled with anxiety and guilt. I shouldn't have let her go on that date. Now that she was in this state, I felt like it was my fault. I wasn't immediately allowed to see Janet. The doctors were busy examining her, and I was filled with fear as I waited in the hallway. My hands were shaking. I was shaking and felt my head getting heavy with the possible consequences of everything that had happened after what seemed like an eternity of waiting. The doctor approached me and was serious and to the point. He told me that my wife was safe but had been seriously exposed to substances, which explained why she was unconscious when I found her. "We'll keep an eye on her to make sure there aren't any other serious problems. You can see her, but she's still under the influence of the drug and may not be completely herself." I nodded, barely holding back tears, and followed the doctor into the room where Janet lay. When I entered, she seemed so fragile, and she looked really vulnerable in the hospital bed, her pale face standing out against the snow-white pillow. I felt really sad when I saw her like that. She opened her eyes a little and smiled when she saw me, Pete. Her voice was barely audible, but she managed to say, "Yes, it's me, my love. I'm here." I took her hand and said, "You'll feel better, everything will be fine." But her eyes were blurred, and she quickly fell back into a half-asleep state. Watching her, I felt a mixture of anger and powerlessness. I was so angry at work for hurting her and at myself for not being able to protect her at that moment. 2 detectives entered the room and introduced themselves, explaining that they were investigating. After asking a few questions, they told us that Worth had already been arrested and would be charged with assault. "We'll let you know when the court date is." One of the detectives said your testimony would be really important. When the detectives left, I sat down next to Janet and took her hand. I was grateful that she was still alive and safe, despite everything that had happened. I was ready to fight for her, stand by her side and protect her, no matter what it took. Sitting there holding her hand, I felt like I could face anything. I thought about our journey together, and how relationships can be so complex, and how life can throw up choices that change everything. At that moment, I was sure of one thing: I loved Janet, and I would always love her. A few hours later, when she had come to her senses a little, we were able to communicate more clearly. We talked, and she apologized for what had happened despite my warnings. I reassured her that what mattered was that she was alive and safe. She cried, and I comforted her, promising that I would never let something like this happen again. Janet was deeply affected by the experience, and her recovery will take time, both physically and emotionally. We both knew there might be challenges ahead, but we decided to get through them together. Her strength and determination inspired me, and I was ready to support her no matter what lay ahead. We also decided that after everything that had happened, we should think about how we both view risk and safety in our lives. This event was a stark reminder that life can be unpredictable and sometimes cruel. We must do our best to protect each other and cherish every moment we have together. Later that day, as we were getting ready to leave the hospital, I told Janet that despite everything that had happened, I was happy that she was my wife. She smiled through her tears and said she loved me. This moment was a reminder for both of us that ultimately it is love that makes life worth living. We left the hospital holding hands, ready to face the future together, no matter how unpredictable it might be.